All right, Fabian, welcome. How you doing?
Good, thanks. Thanks, I'm doing well. Hope you're well in Miami too.
Yeah, so for everyone, we're here with Dr. Fabian Stephany. He is a researcher in computational social science at the Oxford Institute, Internet Institute, that is, at University of Oxford. Now, Fabian, we've had you on before, probably like 18 months ago, or probably a little longer than that. Obviously, the world has morphed and a lot of things have changed. Specifically as it relates to work, probably more important than ever is having you on and kind of discussing some of the trends you're seeing. I think before that, for the sake of the listeners, is just giving a little sense of your background and just hearing a fresh update from you.
Sure. Thanks. So again, thanks for having me on this pretty timely topic. Or like these are exciting times. I mean, not only for work, but also for everything that has to do with the internet. I mean, as you said, I work at the Oxford Internet Institute, which is a department at the University of Oxford. And at our institute, we study how our individual and collective behavior online shapes our social, political, and economic world. And for obvious reasons, a lot of work has been done remote via the internet in recent days. So these are really exciting times for work-related researchers, so researchers that study the future of work, but also people who study how the internet changes our life in general.
Got it. And what work, I guess specifically, have you been working on recently on the subject?
Well, I mean, what we study extensively in our group is our so-called online labor markets or remote platform markets. So these are global marketplaces where people can buy and sell certain services, and obviously these markets as well have gained traction even before COVID-19, but more so through the pandemic right now, through the shift to remote work. And we are specifically studying, how this unfolds globally, but also how this unfolds in terms of skills, which skills or which kind of occupations become more important in these globally connected remote work markets.
Sure. Yeah, no, we're seeing benefits, I guess, for the just kind of breaking into the subject matter at hand is really around the gig economy. And online kind of workforce, where stripping out kind of the physical work environment and deconstructing jobs into their segments. So think of somebody that is a data entry individual that is doing it for a company can now take that job function and do it for either more small businesses and or large organizations. I think COVID was an accelerant of that, where people were sitting at home, right? And understanding that, hey, my job function of someone that is a data entry analyst or a software engineer, maybe I do have 30% downtime, and let me utilize that 30% to essentially fill that role with kind of gig work, for example. I guess, is that kind of a good frame of what has happened over the last 12, 18 months?
Yeah, that's a good description. I mean, it's part of the story. I think when we last spoke, we had just published or were about to publish an interesting piece on the repercussions of COVID-19 on American gig workers in the United States. And back then we were wondering, we imagined two competing effects. One we called the distancing bonus, and one we called the downscaling loss. So the distancing bonus would be exactly something that you described and that had been facilitated by the pandemic, is that now that everybody at companies had to shift to remote work massively, so also had to place their on-site employees to work from home, to work remote. Some of them might have started wondering, well, why can't I now then not hire somebody who works from a completely different place, let's say from the Philippines, and might be cheaper in terms of salary, because living costs in the Philippines are just lower than the United States. And at the same time, on the other hand, we imagine, of course, kind of this downscaling loss. The economy took a severe hit, and some companies just had to cut costs, and so some of them maybe had to cut non-essential spendings, and often these were gig workers, like you described it.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And also I think stepping back and understanding that there's plenty of companies out there that are hiring in hundreds and thousands of employees that in a sense, the company and the individuals around them have never met them. So there's a lot of digital faces in the workforce today. that actually are full-time workers, let's say at Microsoft or some others, that have never met their colleagues at work. And I think that is some sort of trend that is probably going to persist and accelerate the adoption of unknown digital workers out there in the world that essentially have profiles and kind of star rankings, things that you find on like Fiverr and Upwork and some of the other online marketplaces. I guess switching over to like thinking about before and after 2019 or the end of 2019, there was the online marketplaces and also just digital work. How can you, what's your best description of what has evolved over that time in terms of the maturation of that industry?
Yeah, I mean, there are many fascinating things that happened, and we are still as researchers trying to unravel whether these changes would have happened anyhow without this external shock, if you want to call it like that, like researchers, economists would call it. But just to name two of them, and one has to do with geography, the other one has to do with occupations. Two things that we're observing, and we think that they could be related to this, catalyst function that the pandemic has, this acceleration of digitalization of work, of digital transportability of work. One regards geographies, and that is what we see is a huge shift globally speaking. The big macro, birds level perspective is the rise of destinations of freelancer gig worker destinations on online labor markets like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So the Indian subcontinent. These places were popular places for gig workers, for online freelancers of all sorts, but they have become even more popular, let's say, in the last 12, 24 months. And the other one is an occupational shift. So what we see is when I talked about this distancing bonus and the downscaling loss is that it was kind of a mixed picture. There wasn't a clear answer, but once we dissected the work by occupations, we realized that one specific occupation, namely software development and tech work, data work that you just mentioned, this is particularly one segment of the labor market, of the online labor market, that has apparently profited from this shock. So more freelancers joining the market, but also more projects in this segment appearing on online labor platforms.
Yeah, and I would also add that the maturity of these labor platforms. I think Fiverr recently announced a subscription model. I think if you are a seller, if you are a freelancer on some of these sites, the nature of a subscription attached to your service, I think gives you a sense of comfort, right? I think one of probably the hurdles for somebody to move into kind of the freelance economy from the more static full-time economy, I think, is the sense of comfort and understanding the predictability of your income stream. And adding a subscription model to these, I think, is an important aspect of that, of one, maintaining that base of sellers, but also potentially kind of luring in some that are, again, hesitant to move into something that is a little bit more transactional in nature. Yeah. I guess you also published a piece on urbanization within kind of the online marketplace. Tell us your recent findings on that in terms of the capital locations versus kind of farther out in terms of regional.
Yeah, that's a really interesting piece. I mean, I have to correct this though. It's not published yet, but it's a working paper which is out there. So people can, but that makes kind of a big difference for researchers that might not be intuitively understandable for the others. But it's out there, so people can read it. It's a work that has been initiated by a colleague of mine inside business school, and we probably collaborated on this. And it comes back to a very original and old question of the internet. So that now that the internet spans around the world, and a lot of many parts in the world have internet access, though I have to say there are still parts of the world that lack internet access. But broadly speaking, there are many places that potentially, in terms of technology, have access to the internet. They also have access to places like these online labor platforms, remote work platforms that we mentioned earlier. Though the question is, when we look at the activity pattern, when we look at where this work is coming from, how it's flowing, it has a super distinct geography. What does this mean? It's not equally distributed around the world. There are certain, clearly, one is there's certain hotspots. So there's certain places where a lot of projects are, and a lot of high-paid, well-paid projects are. So a lot of profitable projects go to. And the second thing is there are certain flows. So there's certain transactional flows. So there's, for example, a big stream of work being done by gig workers, as I said earlier, on the Indian subcontinent, and then flowing to the East Coast and the West Coast in the United States, for example. So these are one of the most distinct geographical patterns. And we've been wondering, so why is that the case? Why is it that even though potentially everybody with internet access could tap into this global market of talent and of companies looking for talent, but why is it still that we observe these distinct patterns? And one of the things that we found is that the work is intensely concentrated, not only in specific regions of the world, but also within the regions. So both global north and global south, it's concentrated in metropolitan areas. It's concentrated in big cities. And not only the projects, but also the wages are much higher at these places. And we tried to investigate this and try to find out why this is the case. And it definitely has to do something with skills. So this is one of the, this is definitely one of the dimension that separates, draws a border on these online labor markets. So the work is where the skills is, where the human capital is, and this can often be found for various reasons in big metropolitan areas.
No, that's an interesting finding. You would actually somewhat conceptually think the other way in terms of where there was less jobs potentially, that you would find more workers. And yeah, that's a pretty interesting finding. I think another question I really wanted to investigate was really around the overall trend of this online marketplace in terms of we saw the acceleration, COVID. I think you guys, again, we track your online labor index. So if anyone out there that wants to track, and you can kind of quickly define the different components that make up the index. But the online labor index, which again has shown a steady rise in terms of the attraction of online labor, whether this is something that we have a new baseline, right? So this is the new baseline and we grow from here, or we kind of retract back to some old baseline. I think from our standpoint, listening to different companies, whether it's the Upworks and Fiverrs of the world, I think the CEOs there have explained that the baseline has changed. Everything has shifted upwards. And again, when you step back and think about the size of this market in general relative to how much of that is online, I think it's a very, very small amount. So again, if you do think some of this freelance work will continue to accelerate and you think it's going to take place in the online world, then there's a new standard, a new baseline that we grow off of instead of retract below. And this is somewhat of a new normal within kind of freelancing. Again, your take and opinions around that.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's one of the big questions that we tried to tackle. So first of all, thanks for mentioning the Online Labor Index, which has now a brand new hub, a brand new page where it's embedded. It's called the Online Labor Observatory. So www Online Labor Observatory, written with OUs in the British spelling .org. It's a new collaboration done by the Oxford Internet Institute and the International Labour Organization. So we're really proud of this, and there are some new features to explore around the Online Labor Index, so you can customize your data in new ways. We're also tapping into other language domains, so Russian and Spanish speaking online freelance markets, because they are also relevant markets besides the English speaking market. And you can download the customized data. So for people like you and journalists and policymakers who are interested, I can really recommend to visit the page. Maybe we could link that at some point as well. That would be great. And there you can have a look at the Online Labor Index, the revised version, which we now call the Online Labor Index 2020. And indeed, what you've been seeing all along since the Online Labor Index had started in 2016 was a steady growth. You see kind of a seasonal pattern, like a bumpy ride. There are seasonalities like on the traditional labor market, so there's less going on during vacation periods, for example, and more in spring. But what you see is a steady growth, like a steady, solid 10 to 11% annual growth in the demand and the utilization of online freelance work around the world. And the times around COVID has been a particularly bumpy ride, with ups and downs, the distancing bonus and the downscaling loss, like I described earlier. But what we do see is that this steady growth will is definitely, at least that's what the time series trend shows, is definitely going to continue. I would hesitate to read, at least from just this single data piece or piece of information, that we have reached a new benchmark, but there are several trends that point into the direction that this growth is going to continue in the next years and might even accelerate further. So, these two big trends, the digitalization of work, so that we can put certain tasks, we can transfer certain tasks via the internet, and there are more and more technologies coming to us that allow this. I mean, we're having this call now being thousands of kilometers apart, and technology works perfectly. And this is probably also, to a certain extent, due to the market pressure that emerged from the pandemic. This is one thing, and also the fragmentation of work. So with this digitalization, so that you can put tasks into, you can transfer them into digital services. You can also break them down. Like an assembly belt, you can outsource this. So where you had one worker before, you might be able to break down this work into specific tasks, 3 different tasks, and distribute them to 3 different workers, and with these platforms to 3 different workers in 3 different places around the world that might have already adapted their skill set according to this new fragmented demand, and might even individually be better in performing these specific single tasks. You see this diversification of demand, but on the other hand also the diversification of skills of workers. So workers that are really in a very agile way adapting to these new skill demands. They're also picking little fragmented pieces of skills and capabilities in new ways, and this makes this market very agile. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why I think it's going to grow.
Yeah, I think agility is a pretty interesting aspect. The other day, Fiverr spoke at an investor conference, and they highlighted that they have roughly like 350 categories, and they're adding like 30 categories a quarter. And that's pretty interesting, right? Because it's all online, and it's all the world evolves, and when it's digital in nature, the categories can continue to evolve as well. And I think one example of that was obviously during peak COVID, everyone was trying to make podcast covers and video edits. And then as the reopening or the initial reopenings, it shifted to Airbnb description listings. So everyone was trying to have writers for that, and then resume writers and things like that. And that's the flexibility and agility of these platforms, where somebody that has a core competency of, let's say, digital design can make a digital banner, or because essentially they give you a prototype anyways in a digital format. And instead of being a banner in the real world, it's a banner in the digital world. And then if you believe in the whole concept of the metaverse, right, which these digital worlds and digital real estate and all the other stuff that could potentially take place in a kind of 3D virtual reality type of environment, maybe not day to day and hour to hour, but there will be something there. Again, more digital things in this world will probably accelerate more digital online labor as a proxy for jobs, in a sense. My question around that concept is occupation from, I don't know if you noticed any shifts in terms of the type of occupations that essentially accelerated. Again, I know there's a segmentation inside of your labor index where you can track these things. But again, whether you noticed a pickup in a certain category versus another, and any kind of comments there?
So the online labor index breaks down occupations into pretty broad, big categories, like, for example, data entry and clerical work, creative and multimedia work, or software development and tech. And in particular, this last category is interesting because so what we've seen initially when this project started was something interesting, and it was a lack of specialization. Because essentially, if you look at global markets where goods and services are traded, and you think of it as an economist, one of the early lessons that you learn as an economist, that it's always good to specialize. So to use the comparative advantage that you have in, for example, producing cars, in contrast to harvesting lemons, for example. So a country that's better in producing cars, in manufacturing, should go for manufacturing, specialize in that, and then export goods into the world. And we thought, like, in a market that has even less frictions than, let's say, the traditional economic trade of goods, the online labor market, we thought that we see an even stronger specialization in terms of work, in terms of occupations. But that's something we didn't see at the beginning. That was really interesting. But now, apparently, we see a shift towards an increase demand and supply, actually, for software development and tech work. And this is also in terms of the so-called supply side, worker side, driven by an increase in workers registering from, as I mentioned earlier, from countries like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. But one thing that I have to mention here is that we should increasingly, and that kind of continues our conversation on skills and, this agile recombination of skills, we should increasingly question occupations, I think. We should increasingly, occupations help us, to understand the world, and we'll ask you, so what do you do? Okay, I'm a podcaster, you're an economist, he's a painter. But we should, particularly on markets that are so agile, like these online remote work platforms, question these occupational domains, because people really started to cherry pick, certain specific skills that might not be typical or conventional for their occupations, but they might be really helpful for them to have a sustainable income on these remote markets.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. In terms of again, the different description of what someone does. It's more your work title should be the description of what you do, as opposed to kind of this high level folder. So I work in finance, and that really tells you nothing. And again, in some of these surveys and census would essentially define us all the same. I think we'll end there. I think this was a really good update. Again, if you wanted to hear the original one, go back, listen almost 18, 12, 24 months ago, and you would hear our original thoughts on this subject matter. But for you, Fabian, just give us a sense of what next you're working on, and then where we can learn about it. I know you talked about the website, but in general, what are you working on, and where can we learn about it?
Yeah, thanks so much. This is, you might guess this already from what I said earlier, but it's really about skills. It's really fascinating. The future of work has, maybe a kind of blurred outlook for all of us, whether we work on remote markets or we work in the on-site economy, if you want to make this distinction at all. But I think online labor markets, online freelance markets might help us to understand how this future of work is going to evolve. The fragmentation of specific occupations, the cherry picking of specific skills, because on these markets, it pays off if you know marketable in-demand skills. And so they might give us, a perspective into the future of work, an outlook into the future of work, how this is going to be done on-site as well in the future. And so our research really focus more closely on skills now, on skill development. And we see how online workers assemble their skills in a very fragmented and individualistic fashion. And the Skill Scale project, that's a new project that we're launching now, is going to have a closer look at that. But if you want to stay tuned on all these developments, I think our new hub, the Online Labor Observatory, is really a good place to stay tuned. We have blog posts there and newsletters, so you can follow us there. Cool.
Fabian, Appreciate having you on. We'll check back in, hopefully sooner than 18, 24 months. But yeah, it was a good update. I think we learned a lot, and again, we'll be in touch.
Cool. My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.